And lastly, we're going to talk about materials. And different materials will treat lighting differently, whether it will reflect or absorb light. So to start off, not all materials are the same, so they shouldn't be shaded the same in digital art as well. And when we look at a material, we recognize it based on their properties and by their surface texture and how it treats lighting. So for example, skin is typically on the duller side, but when you add in properties that are higher in contrast with the concentrated highlights, it gives the impression of the skin being wet or shiny. So you can think of every surface of a material on a scale from dull, which would absorb light, to shiny, which would reflect it. And every surface will treat lighting differently, and as you draw in the lighting, think about the properties of the material and how much it would absorb the lighting and how much it would reflect it. Because every surface will do a combination of both, but will typically lean towards one or the other, resulting in looking either more shiny or more dull. So materials that appear to be more dull are materials that absorb light, have a lower contrast, and have a low light concentration. And the opposite's true for shiny materials because it reflects light, it has a higher contrast, and it usually has a high light concentration as well. So here's a visual representation of materials going from more dull to shiny. So on the left side we have wood and skin, and other dull objects would be like fabric and leather. And then on the right side we have wet skin and metal, and the other shiny materials could be like plastic or ceramics, anything that really gives a nice shine or a gleam to it. So while you're doing your own concepts, really look at the different materials that you're adding to the subject matter and think about, okay, where would this material land on the scale from dull to shiny? And then try to represent that the best you can. Because if you shaded everything in the exact same manner, then it would come across that you're only using one material for your entire concept. And if you have a whole bunch of different materials like metal and leather, and maybe even if it was on a character, so there would be some skin involved, if they were all shaded the same, it would appear that they all had the same properties, and that's not true. So you want to make sure you're differentiating the objects that are more on the dull side from the objects that are more on the shiny side. So now let's talk about highlights and specular points. So like we've talked about, for every surface you must first determine whether or not the material has a dull or a shiny surface. So most shiny materials will have a very smooth surface and have a high concentration of light. So in our little example you can see how when the sunlight hits a smooth surface, it would have a very strong specular point and it would be not scattered at all. It would be located in one centralized area. And then most dull materials usually have some sort of a surface to it, and that's why the light is kind of spread around and it's not concentrated as much. So this is an example of skin close-up, and skin has a bumpy surface, so the light is being spread around rather than being located in one central point. And that's what gives skin a lower contrast look and also has a low light concentration feel to it as well. But when the skin gets wet or it has become sweaty, a thin layer smooths out the surface, making it appear shiny. So you can see in the example it almost has like a gloss layer to it on top of the skin layer, and that's what gives it that centralized lighting point and gives it a nice strong highlight. So when you think about it, materials aren't that difficult. You just have to think about what surface texture it has and whether or not it will be more on the dull or shiny side, and then place them on the scale accordingly. So from here, you should go out and practice drawing different materials and how to shade them correctly, whether they're more dull or more shiny. And most of the times I see these done on spheres, but just remember with a sphere, it's easy to place predictable tonal changes. But most surfaces have a texture to them, so you have to also consider the texture of the surface when placing your highlights. So lastly, don't let materials intimidate you. Be in charge of controlling how much the lighting is affecting the surface and then reflecting it appropriately. And that's it. So that was the entire Getting Started course, and if you want to go out and learn more, we definitely have more resources available on the site. So if you're curious about some things like brushes, we have a whole bunch of brushes that you can go ahead and download. Or if you're more curious on doing more character tutorials, we have some of that for you as well. And for every tutorial in this course, there was a handout that went along with each of them. So if you want something as a quick reference guide, you can go ahead and download each of the handouts as well. But the most important thing is to really have fun and never stop learning, because digital art takes a lot of time and practice, and you can't learn drawing if you don't actually practice it. So thanks again for checking out this Getting Started in Digital Art series.